Hello everyone. In this video, we will discuss about Azure Virtual Networking. Azure Virtual Networking is also called as Azure VNET. Azure VNET is a infrastructure as a service resource. So whenever you create a virtual network, it is similar to the traditional or legacy data center. You have the servers. Right? You have this particular server, which is physical server, and this servers, or there can be many servers which are connecting to the Ethernet switch, which is nothing but the LAN switch. So these servers, how it is going and connecting to the switch, similar way, when you create a virtual network, you will be provided with a router. So this router, you will be able to create multiple networks. You can have multiple networks, which is called as subnet. So this is one big network when you create a virtual network in Azure. And this particular virtual network can have multiple subnets. I will call this as subnet 1, subnet 2, subnet 3, subnet 4, subnet 5. There can be multiple subnets similar to this. You will be able to create multiple subnets. So this router will provide DHCP and DNS. This is like the Wi-Fi what you have at home. The Wi-Fi also provides the same thing. It will also provide the DHCP IP address for your mobile or your laptops, and also it will allow the DNS forwarding for the devices, which is your mobile device or your laptop device, to communicate with the internet. So similar way, whatever virtual machines you are going to deploy on the virtual network, these virtual machines can communicate between each other. So this virtual machine can communicate with this or any of the virtual machine within this VNet. So any virtual machine which you have created in this subnet, it can talk to any of the virtual machine within the same network. And also the virtual machines, whatever you have created in this virtual network, it can also communicate via the internet. It can access Google, google.com, microsoft.com, or any websites you will be able to access from any of the virtual machine, because by default outbound connection to the external network is allowed. Apart from communicating within the virtual network and also accessing the internet, using this virtual network, we can also communicate to our data center. So we can connect to our data center as well. So this can be via the virtual private network or express route. So let us understand what is the virtual network now. It will provide isolation and segmentation. It also provides internet communication, which we have discussed. Any virtual machine which you have created inside the virtual network can talk to the internet. Communicate between Azure resources. You will be able to communicate within the virtual network. This virtual machine can talk to any virtual machine inside the virtual network. And we are also able to communicate with the on-prem resources. So we are able to communicate with the data center, which is on-prem data center. We can actually manage the network traffic to route the network traffic in a certain way. And using the network security group, we can filter the inbound and outbound network traffics. We can also connect the virtual network. If this is the virtual network 01, this is the virtual network 01, I have another virtual network which is 02. I can actually connect these two virtual network, which has another set of subnets, another set of virtual machines running on each of the subnet. Azure Virtual Networking supports both public and private endpoints. So whatever virtual machines which you have created and deployed inside the virtual network, it will get the private IP address. So this will get the private IP address from the range of IP address what you have used for your virtual network. Say for example, if I have used 10.18.0.0/16, and for this particular subnet I have used 10.18.0.1.24. From this range, I will get a IP address for this virtual machine. It can be 10.18.0.6/24. For each of the subnets in the virtual network, we have 5 IP address reserved. So this is for Azure internal use. So for each subnet, you have 5 IPs which are reserved. Apart from these 5 IPs, the virtual machine will get a different set of IP address from this range. And you are also able to create and assign the public IP address. This is for the external computer to access the virtual machine, which is inside the virtual network. Once you assign the public IP address for any of the virtual machine inside the virtual network, if I assign a public IP address for this virtual machine from the outer world, which is external network, which is internet, I can use PC or my laptop to connect to this virtual machine using the public IP address. I can connect via the internet. Isolation and segmentation. We can create multiple subnets out of the virtual network what we have created. These are called as subnets, and each of the subnet will have its own range of IP address. As I said, 10.18.0.0 is the network. This is for the virtual network what we have created. I can create multiple subnets out of this range. For subnet 01, I can use 10.18.0.0/24, and for subnet 02, I can use 10.18.1.0/24. This is for subnet 02. From this range of IP address, one of the IP address will be assigned to the virtual machine. Each subnet gets an IP range from the defined IP range at the VNet. So this is the range of IP address which is configured at the virtual network layer. From this range, I will get the subset of the IP range for my subnet. For subnet 3, I will have 10.18.2.0/24. I can go on creating the subnets depending upon the subnets what I can configure out of this particular range. For name resolution, we can use Azure internal DNS or external DNS. As I said, when we create the virtual network, we are basically creating the router on the Azure cloud. So we have multiple subnets, right? Which we are going to create subnet, subnet, and subnet. This router will provide DHCP and DNS facility. I can communicate to any of the resources which are created inside this subnet using the DNS FQDN, which is the internal DNS at the Azure cloud. And also I can use the external DNS. If I have the on-prem setup with the hybrid cloud, if I have hybrid cloud, and in my on-prem, if I have the DNS, this will be my external DNS. I can use this external DNS to configure for these subnets as well. So either I can choose Azure internal DNS or external DNS. Internet access for all the resources which I have created inside the virtual network as outbound connection enabled by default. So any virtual machine which you have created inside the virtual network can access the internet. And we can also use the public IP address. We can create the public IP address and assign to the virtual machine. This will allow the external user to connect to the virtual machine. Communicate between Azure resources securely. It is not only that you have the virtual network created, right? And you also create the subnets. Say for example, this virtual network has two subnet 01, subnet 02. If I wanted to access the other Azure services, like the PaaS-based services, these PaaS-based services doesn't have the virtual network configured. So you don't configure the virtual network for the PaaS solutions, for the web application, for the Azure SQL, for containers, Kubernetes. If I wanted to access from this virtual machine any of the other Azure resources, I'll be able to allow the virtual network access from this particular resource itself. So when I configure the web application, I have an option to allow the virtual network and what range of IP address I can allow from this web application. I have an option. If I choose the option to allow the certain IP address range, because my virtual network IP address range is 2.0.24. If I allow for this subnet, all the resources which are in this subnet can talk to the PaaS solution, which is nothing but the web application. So this virtual network has 10.18.0.0.16, and I am allowing only this subnet for the other Azure resources access. I can also do that using Azure resources securely. So whatever communication which is happening between the virtual network and the other services, it will happen in a secure, because this is within the Azure backbone network. And also we can use service endpoints to connect to other Azure resource type, such as Azure SQL database and storage accounts. You will get a endpoints, and you can integrate those endpoints to your resources from where you want to access the other Azure resources. It is not only that you create a virtual network and all the resources within the virtual network can talk to each other or communicate between each other within the same virtual network. You can also configure the virtual network to connect to your data center. So if this is your Azure cloud and you have a virtual network created, this virtual network can connect to your data center using VPN. So this can be point-to-point, site-to-site VPN or via the express route. So there are three options how you can connect your virtual network to your on-prem data center. So either it will be point-to-point, site-to-site, and express route. Express route provides high bandwidth because it is direct connection between the Azure data center and your data center using the co-location or direct connection to the Azure data center itself. Point-to-point connection is basically you have the users who are accessing from the remote location. There can be multiple users who have the laptop or desktop, they wanted to connect to the Azure cloud to your virtual network and access some resources. They have the VPN client running on the laptop or desktop. So they have the VPN client running. They can connect to the virtual network and they will be able to access the resources. This will be encrypted via the VPN. Basically, they are accessing using the internet. So all these connections, all these users who are accessing your Azure resources are via the internet VPN, and this particular connection is encrypted. In site-to-site communication, it also uses the internet. And this is also encrypted. This is also an encrypted connection. You need to set up the router at the data center, and also you use the VPN gateway at the Azure Virtual Network layer. You will be able to communicate from virtual network to your data center. The difference between point-to-site VPN and site-to-site VPN is basically in point-to-site VPN, you use the VPN client to access your Azure resources. In site-to-site VPN, you configure the router so that whatever resources at the data center can be allowed to access the Azure resources. So here you are allowing individual users who have the VPN client installed to access the Azure resources, whereas it is data center and the Azure network communication. The third option for hybrid connection is express route. You can use express route for greater bandwidth and even for higher levels of security. Only thing is it will take some time to get the connection done at the Azure network and also at your data center. So how does the Azure Virtual Network route the traffic? By default, whatever resources you have created inside the virtual network, everything is allowed to communicate between each other inside the network. All the resources within the network, within the subnet, can communicate between each other. It can also communicate with on-prem network if you have configured any three types of hybrid network like point-to-site VPN, site-to-site VPN, or express route connections. You can also connect two virtual networks. By default, the outbound connection to the internet is allowed. So whatever resources you have deployed on your virtual network, all the resources can access the internet by default. Other methods to route, you can define the routing tables. Also, you can use BGP, which is Border Gateway Protocol, to route between the networks. So everything is fine. I have created the virtual network. I have created the subnets. I am able to configure the virtual network to connect to the on-prem data center using point-to-site or site-to-site or express route connection method. Now, after doing all this, how do I control or filter the network traffic? I am able to filter the network traffic using the network security group. I can control the inbound and outbound traffic using the security rules. I can also set up a network virtual appliance so that it will allow the inbound traffic via one particular network virtual appliance, and any outbound connection or inbound connection will go via this particular network virtual appliance. I can use this method also to filter the traffic. We can also connect two different virtual networks. For example, if this is my virtual network, VNET 01, I have some subnets which are created here, and these subnets has some resources. And this is virtual network 02. This also has some subnets. If I wanted to communicate between these two virtual networks, I can configure something called as VNET Peering. If any of the resources in this particular subnet wanted to talk to this subnet, this can be virtual machine. Here there is a virtual machine. This can go via the peering network and connect to this virtual machine. This is within the Azure backbone network. Azure backbone network is nothing but the internal to the Azure network. So this is what communicates via the Microsoft backbone network, never entering the public network. Peering enables resources in each virtual network to communicate with each other. These virtual networks can be in a separate region. I can also configure the virtual network in different region, EU East, EU West. So these are in two different regions, but still I am able to configure the VNET peering and communicate between the resources. So these virtual networks can be in a separate region. There is something called as user-defined routes, which is nothing but UDR. These routes are different from the system routes, and these routes can be configured for greater control over the network traffic flow. You wanted to see to that which resources can talk to which resource via what networks. So those you can define by yourself, which is user defined routes. Thank you for watching the video. If you like the content, please subscribe and share. Thank you and take care.